The Tigris River ran black with ink and red with blood. That is not metaphor. That is the memory left behind by the fall of Baghdad in 1258, when the Mongols did not merely capture the greatest city of the Islamic world, but performed something closer to civilizational execution. Libraries were ripped apart and thrown into the water until the river itself seemed to carry the death of knowledge downstream. Palaces were emptied. Streets became butchers' yards. Men, women, and children were cut down in numbers so enormous that later chroniclers reached for impossible figures because ordinary arithmetic no longer felt large enough. Whether one accepts every medieval number exactly or not, the truth remains monstrous. A world that had believed itself ancient, refined, and central discovered in a matter of days that all those things meant nothing before an enemy that treated cities not as prizes to occupy, but as warnings to the next city. This is the emotional climate in which our story begins. The Mongols were not simply another conquering power on the edges of the map. They were the collapse of maps. From China to Poland, the pattern repeated often enough that terror itself became one of their most effective weapons. News of them did part of the work before their horses even appeared. Kings hesitated, governors fled, garrisons negotiated before the ladders touched the walls. It was not cowardice alone. It was learned experience. Those who resisted often vanished. And after Baghdad, the next great prize before them was obvious: Cairo, the last major center of Islamic power still standing outside their grasp. If Egypt fell, the road into North Africa opened. If Egypt fell, the political heart of the Arab world would stop beating. If Egypt fell, the surviving architecture of Islamic civilization might not recover in any recognizable form. That is why the year 1260 mattered so much. The issue was no longer dynastic rivalry, provincial rebellion, or the ordinary turbulence of medieval politics. It was whether a civilization already reeling could still produce men hard enough to save it. In Cairo, the man on the throne was Sultan Qutuz. He was not born to silk's marble or the decorative certainty of old hereditary power. He had been a slave. That matters because it places him within the singular institution that made the coming victory possible: the Mamluks. They were not slave soldiers in the simple modern sense, as if they were chained captives handed spears. They were boys, purchased young, converted, drilled, reconditioned, educated in arms, horsemanship, discipline, and command, then remade into a military aristocracy whose entire identity rested on violent excellence. A man born into that system lost family tribe and inherited safety early. In return, he gained a new world in which merit under arms could become power. This produced a warrior class of unusual hardness. The Mamluks were not local peasants reluctantly defending their fields. They were men shaped from youth to understand war as their first language. That distinction is crucial, because when the Mongols sent envoys demanding submission, they expected what most rulers before had eventually given them: fear disguised as diplomacy. Qutuz answered with an act so extreme that it instantly changed the psychological balance of the coming war. He had the Mongol envoys executed and their heads displayed on the gates of Cairo. That was not theatrical cruelty for its own sake. It was strategic defiance. He was telling the entire city, his own officers, and the enemy watching from afar, that negotiation had ended before it began. Egypt would not wait behind its walls to be chosen for death. It would ride out to meet the storm. Beside Qutuz stood the more dangerous mind Baybars. In many stories of this period, Qutuz is the necessary sovereign, and Baybars the necessary edge. That is too simple, but it contains a useful truth. Baybars possess the kind of military intelligence that sees not only the enemy's strength, but the shape of the enemy's confidence. He had blue eyes, steppe ancestry, slave origins, and a mind sharpened by years inside the Mamluk machine. He understood something the complacent and the pious often refuse to understand in time. The Mongols were not unbeatable, but they were uniquely good at turning the assumptions of other armies against them. Their cavalry was lighter, faster, and tactically freer than the heavy horse most Islamic and European commanders relied on. Their horse archers could kill while withdrawing. Their feigned retreat was not a trick used occasionally. It was an operational language. They could make brave men run themselves to death through pride. So the problem facing Egypt was not simply how to stand against a stronger enemy. It was how to catch an enemy built around mobility and deception without being destroyed by the very methods used to catch him. Baybars saw that any straightforward battle fought on the wrong ground would end in Islamic extinction. Yet he also knew that hiding behind Cairo's walls would only postpone death and hand the Mongols the initiative they always exploited best. Therefore, the only viable answer was the hardest one. Leave Egypt. March into Palestine. Intercept the enemy before he reached the Nile. Seize the field psychologically before he seized it physically. That decision alone was extraordinary. Most observers expected Islamic defense to contract, fortify, and pray. Instead, the Mamluks moved forward to hunt the hunters. Facing them was Kitbuka, the Mongol commander left in Syria, when Hulagu withdrew eastward in response to succession politics after the Great Khan's death. That detail matters because it means the Mongol army at Ain Jalut was not the total force of Hulagu's western campaign, but neither was it some weak afterthought. It was an experienced and confident vanguard commanded by a man with every reason to believe history still belonged to him. Kitbuka had not yet tasted defeat. He had seen cities bow rulers flee and enemies die under the weight of Mongol certainty. When he looked at the Mamluks, he likely saw a familiar pattern. Another regional power finally cornered into desperate resistance. Another enemy about to become instructional slaughter. That arrogance would help kill him. But arrogance alone does not explain what happened. The Mamluks had to create conditions under which Mongol confidence would become a tactical liability. For that terrain mattered. They chose Ain Jalut Goliath's Spring, a narrow valley pressed between the Gilboa Mountains and surrounding hills. This was no random battlefield stumbled into by marching armies. It was selected because it reduced one of the Mongols' greatest advantages room. Steppe cavalry thrives on breadth. It needs space to wheel, withdraw, envelop, and reappear. Compress that movement into a constrained valley, and numbers begin losing some of their natural fluidity. Baybars understood that if the fight could be narrowed, concealed reserves could matter more, and Mongol cavalry shock could be redirected into something like overcommitment. But terrain alone never wins. The enemy still had to be pulled into it properly. That is where the most dangerous part of the plan emerged. Baybars himself would command the visible vanguard. His task was not to win the first clash. His task was to lose convincingly enough that the Mongols would do what they had done to so many others, pursue, without caution, into the killing space prepared for them. This is what makes the deception so audacious. The feigned retreat is the signature Mongol weapon. To use it against the masters of it required not bravery alone, but precision so fine that the difference between success and annihilation was measured in heartbeat and saddle distance. Baybars had to appear weak without becoming weak, frightened, without losing control, broken without actually letting the line dissolve. He was not merely acting for the enemy. He was gambling his life and the future of his civilization on the enemy believing the performance. So the Mamluk army moved quietly into position among the Galilean folds of land. The main body hid where the landscape would conceal mass until the right moment. Baybars remained visible below with a relatively small force. Then came the rumble, first felt in the chest, then seen as rising dust, then heard as the accumulated noise of horse metal command and certainty. The Mongols descended as they had so many times before, fast enough to feel like weather. Here, the psychology of command becomes everything. A normal man standing before an enemy that had erased Baghdad might already be halfway to defeat internally. Baybars held. He did not let his line dissolve at the sight of what was coming. He made the Mongols pay just enough in the first contact to confirm their contempt. The Mamluk vanguard fought hard, but with measured aggression. They struck, withdrew, pivoted, and yielded ground deliberately. Every motion said the same thing to Mongol eyes. These men are brave enough to resist for a moment, but they are still going to break. Kitbuka saw what he expected to see. That is always the deepest trap. Great deceptions work not because they invent a fantasy, but because they feed an appetite already present in the observer. Kitbuka wanted confirmation that the Mamluks would panic like others had panicked. Baybars gave him exactly enough of that impression to make pursuit irresistible. When the signal finally came, and the Mamluk vanguard broke into apparent disorder, turning and fleeing deeper into the valley, the Mongols did not pause to question why prey was running toward enclosed terrain. They surged forward. The hunt was on. Or so they believed. The valley did the first part of the work. Dust thickened, vision compressed, noise echoed strangely. The deeper the Mongols drove into the narrowing ground, the less room they had to maneuver in the easy, predatory patterns that had served them so well on open steppe. Baybars continued leading them inward until the geometry was right. Then the entire battle changed in an instant. The Mamluk vanguard halted, turned and faced the pursuers. At the same time, horns sounded from the hills. The concealed army emerged. Suddenly, the Mongols were no longer hunters, but men inside a ring of hostile force, closing from multiple directions. The Mamluk cavalry charged downhill with all the force of men who understood exactly what was at stake. For perhaps the first time in their campaigning memory, the Mongols felt what so many others had felt before them: constriction, confusion. The realization that the battlefield was not doing what it was supposed to do. That mattered psychologically as much as tactically, because Mongol discipline was iron, but it had been forged in a system where motion was safety. Here, motion was carrying them deeper into encirclement. Still, the Mongols did not collapse immediately. This is essential to preserve, because Ain Jalut matters more when the enemy is respected properly. Kitbuka rallied. The Mongols counterattacked with exactly the kind of furious professionalism that had made them dominant in the first place. They drove hard against the Mamluk left, trying to smash open space and escape the tightening ring. For a moment, the line wavered. That moment is one of the true hinges of world history. If the Mamluk flank had broken cleanly, the battle might have turned back toward Mongol operational logic. Kutuz saw the danger. Then he did something as theatrical as it was necessary. He cast off his helmet so his face would be visible, rode directly toward the critical sector, and shouted a battle cry with enough force to cut through the chaos. This is not a trivial anecdote. Command in pre-modern battle often depends on physical visibility at moments of maximum uncertainty. Men who are close to breaking can sometimes be reconstituted, not by a plan they cannot see, but by the sight of the one figure whose continued presence makes retreat feel dishonorable. Kutuz's appearance did exactly that. The wavering stopped. The Mamluks hardened again around him. What had been near fracture turned into renewed fury. Now the confined ground began favoring the Mamluks more decisively. At close range, Mongol archery lost much of its shaping power. The fight became denser, meaner, more dependent on blade shield and personal violence in compressed space. Here, the Mamluk system showed its value. These were not levied peasants stiffened by piety. These were professional slave cavalry and soldiers trained from youth to fight under brutal conditions. They could absorb, shock, regroup, and push in ways few armies outside the Mongols themselves could match. The pressure turned back on Kitbuka. Surrounded, denied clean space, unable to deploy his usual operational depth, he fought on with the hard pride of a man who understood perfectly well that defeat here was more than personal. In some accounts, he might have escaped briefly had he chosen flight early enough. He did not. Whether from loyalty, fatalism, warrior code, or refusal to become the first great Mongol commander. In this theater to live with shame, he stayed. Eventually, he was overwhelmed, captured, and brought before Kutuz. Even then, according to the transcript's dramatic framing, he did not beg. He warned, "Kill me, and greater vengeance follows." That warning was not empty in general historical terms. The Mongol state did indeed possess the capacity for terrible retaliation, but on that field it had become powerless. Kutuz ordered his execution. Kitbuka's severed head was raised for all to see. The effect on Mongol morale was devastating. The center had not merely failed, it had lost its commander in full view of the men still trying to resist. Now, the thing that had happened to others began happening to them. Panic, disorder, break. The invincible army became a routed mass. And Baybars, who had shaped the trap from the beginning, showed no interest in leaving survivors enough dignity to rebuild the myth. Pursuit was ruthless. Men fleeing into reed beds and broken ground were hunted down, and according to the transcript, even the reeds were set ablaze to smoke and burn out those still hiding there. Whether every detail can be documented at literal scale or not, the broader truth is that Ain Jalut ended not in negotiated respect between rival great armies, but in annihilative pursuit. The Mamluks understood what the moment meant. A partial victory would not suffice. The psychological empire of Mongol invincibility had to be smashed as visibly as possible, not merely checked. When the sun set over the valley, the field was covered in bodies. The world had changed. The Mongols could be defeated in open battle by a Muslim army. That sentence alone altered history. It stiffened resistance elsewhere, preserved Egypt and Syria as centers of Islamic power, and prevented the complete strategic collapse that had seemed imaginable after Baghdad. Had the Mamluks failed at Ain Jalut, the consequences are impossible to exaggerate. Cairo might have fallen. North Africa might have opened. The later Islamic and even European intellectual worlds would have grown out of a radically different landscape of ruin. Ain Jalut was not only a battle, it was an existential hinge. Yet victory over the external enemy did not produce peace among the victors. This is where the story becomes darker and more recognizably human. Power had been shared under necessity between Qutuz and Baybars. Necessity was now receding. What remained was ambition, prestige, and reward. Baybars had risked everything in the vanguard. He had designed the key deception. He had every reason to feel that the triumph belonged to him, at least as much as to the Sultan. He asked for Aleppo as a reward. Qutuz refused. That refusal may have been politically understandable. Great rulers are often wary of empowering the very men who made them necessary, but it was strategically catastrophic for Qutuz himself. He had just denied a dangerous man the recognition that might have bought temporary loyalty. In the Mamluk world, where power was never secure, merely because ceremony said it was, such slights did not remain personal for long. They became succession crises, waiting for a road, a tent, a moment of reduced guard. That moment came on the return march near Salihia. Qutuz rode out to hunt with only a small retinue, most of whom were already compromised by conspiracy. The old story says Baybars approached under the pretense of kissing the Sultan's hand in a gesture of submission or thanks. Whether the exact choreography unfolded that way matters less than the strategic truth Qutuz allowed himself to be reached by men whose ambitions he had failed to neutralize. Steel appeared. The victor of Ain Jalut was struck down not by Mongol lance, but by internal betrayal. The irony is savage. The man who had helped save the Islamic world from apocalypse died before he could enjoy the peace purchased by that salvation. In the desert, with no grand court around him, power changed hands the way it so often does in military aristocracies, fast, intimate, and bloody. Baybars wasted no time. The corpse was scarcely cooling before allegiance began being redirected. He understood exactly what had to happen next. No vacuum, no public hesitation, no open contest until he already held the center. On the road back to Cairo, he did not present himself as murderer. He presented himself as the true hero of Ain Jalut, the man still able to keep the Mongols out and the realm together. By the time the full truth of Kutuz's death spread, Baybars was already too embedded in command to be dislodged cheaply. That is one of his great political talents. He knew that legitimacy can be built backward from possession if possession is acquired fast enough. Once enthroned, Baybars proved that his ambition had not exceeded his ability. This is what makes him historically immense rather than merely notorious. Many men can assassinate a ruler. Far fewer can then build a state worthy of the crime. Baybars set about doing exactly that. He reorganized the Mamluk military system under tighter control, strengthened fortresses, secured lines of communication, and treated intelligence as the nervous system of survival. The transcript's reference to a rapid postal network is especially important because it reveals how administrative sophistication underpinned his violence. Relay horses' message routes, faster communication from Damascus to Cairo. These were not luxuries. They were strategic necessities. In a world where warning time could decide whether a Mongol column met readiness or panic, Baybars also understood the diplomatic dimension of survival. Rather than confront the entire Mongol world as a single bloc, he exploited its internal fractures, opening ties with the Golden Horde Mongols of the north, who had converted to Islam and were increasingly hostile to Hulagu's Ilkhanate. This was a master stroke. Baybars did not merely defeat Mongols in battle. He made some Mongols part of the strategic cage around other Mongols. He also re-established an Abbasid caliph in Cairo, not as a true sovereign, but as a legitimizing symbol. Baghdad had fallen, but Cairo would now claim continuity. This mattered enormously. It turned Egypt from one surviving Muslim power into the symbolic center of restored Islamic political dignity. Baybars was not just wielding swords. He was rearranging the grammar of authority. Then he turned westward and southward against the Crusader states. This, too, was logical. Once the Mongol threat had been blunted, the lingering Latin enclaves along the Levantine coast became intolerable, both strategically and ideologically. Baybars moved against them with the same blend of speed, terror deception, and system that had defined his earlier career. Caesarea, Arsuf, Antioch, and above all the great fortress of Crac de Chevalier, felt the pressure of a man who did not mistake chivalric reputation for practical defensive value. His siege methods were not romantic. They were relentless. He used bombardment, mining intimidation, and forged letters when needed. Antioch fell in a catastrophe so complete that it effectively ended the city's significance as a Christian power center in the East. The psychological letter Baybars sent afterward to Bohemond VI, describing in vicious detail the destruction of what the prince had lost, remains one of the great documents of deliberate humiliation. It tells us something essential about Baybars. He wanted enemies not only beaten, but internally broken. Memory itself was to become another battlefield. He even bent the famous assassins, the Nizari Ismailis, of the Syrian mountains into his orbit through pressure and intimidation. Again, the pattern appears. Baybars does not merely reduce visible fortresses. He absorbs or neutralizes networks. He wants every blade in the region either under his influence or under his fear. That is statecraft at its most predatory. And when Edward of England later arrived in the East attempting to revive Crusader energy, Baybars answered not simply with armies, but with covert violence, using an assassin to try to cut the future Edward I down in his own quarters. The prince survived, but the message landed. No one was safe. Baybars was building not just a sultanate, but a climate. His greatest purely military late triumph came in 1277 at Elbistan, where he invaded into Mongol-controlled Anatolia and once again proved that Ain Jalut had not been mere luck or one-time surprise. There, facing Mongol and allied forces on hard ground, he chose bold frontal violence at the decisive moment and won a battle that demonstrated Mamluk battlefield superiority in conditions far from Egypt itself. That victory mattered because it reinforced the larger transformation he had already begun. The Mongol aura was not merely damaged, it was containable. There were now lines, political, military, mental, that the descendants of Genghis could not simply cross at will. Baybars had drawn them. This is why his reign stands so large in the historical imagination of the Islamic world. He was not admired like Saladin for knightly grace or broad ecumenical romance. He was something else, the man willing to become harder than the age, in order to keep the age from collapsing entirely. He was ruthless because the world he inhabited punished softness with extinction. That same ruthlessness defined his end. Great predators tend to die not in serenity, but inside the habits that made them dangerous. The transcript offers one of the classic stories poison meant for a rival mixed into kumis, or another drink consumed by Baybars himself through confusion or fate. Whether every detail happened exactly in that manner is less important than the symbolic truth it preserves. A man who had lived by intrigue, suspicion, and calculated violence died inside the same ecosystem of plots and counterplots he had mastered. He did not fall to a Mongol arrow or a Frankish blade. He was undone by the politics of his own kind of world. After around 13 agonizing days, he died in Damascus on July 1st, 1277. Even in death, his regime's first instinct was control. His body was concealed during the return toward Egypt, so that succession could be managed before chaos knew its cue. That, too, feels perfectly Baybarsian. Secrecy timing possession before announcement. He had taught the system well. His legacy is therefore impossible to reduce to simple morality. Baybars was not a saint. He was not clean. He murdered his sovereign, ruled through fear where needed, and often where fear was simply more efficient than gentleness. Yet none of that changes the scale of what he accomplished. He halted the Mongols at the moment when the Islamic world most needed someone capable of doing so. He recentered political and symbolic authority in Cairo after Baghdad's ruin. He reduced the Crusader states to terminal weakness, paving the way for their final destruction in 1291. He built communications military organization and diplomatic structures that allowed the Mamluk Sultanate to dominate the eastern Mediterranean world for generations. And he did it not as a prince raised to expect command, but as a former slave remade by one of the harshest institutions ever devised. That is why the question at the center of his story remains so uncomfortable and so powerful. What does it cost to save a civilization from annihilation? Baybars offers one answer, and it is not a comforting one. Sometimes the man history needs is not noble in the soft literary sense. Sometimes he is simply the one willing to do what gentler men cannot force themselves to do while the walls are still standing. Baybars understood survival as a sacred commandment, more important than beauty, reputation, or moral ease. He lived and ruled accordingly. The roads that later grew safer, the trade that later flowed the mosques and schools, that later flourished under Mamluk protection, all stood in the shadow of a victory won by men who were willing to become the nightmare their enemies expected, and then something colder still. That is the real weight of Baybars. Not that he was good, but that without him, the world he defended might not have survived long enough to debate goodness at all.